Even when the death penalty isn't on the table, many notorious killers find that karma catches up with them behind bars. From a feared crime boss, beaten to death with a padlock wrapped in a sock, his eyes almost gouged out, and his tongue nearly cut off, to a vicious serial killer who was stabbed 47 times, fate has a way of delivering its own deadly justice. Here are some of the most dangerous killers who met violent ends in prison. Leroy Martin. First on the list is Leroy Martin, aka the Gaffney Strangler, a notorious serial killer from Gaffney, South Carolina, who said, "Sometimes there just ain't no news, and people have to do things to make news." Indeed, he made bloody news by committing crimes that terrorized the small town in Cherokee County between 1967 and 1968. On the night of May 20th, 1967, Annie Lucille Dedmond had one drink too many and left her husband Roger outside a donut shop in Gaffney, South Carolina. This behavior was somewhat typical for her after drinking, leading Roger not to immediately worry about her disappearance. The following morning brought sickening news. Annie's body was found in the center of a highway connecting the towns of Union, South Carolina, and Spindale, North Carolina. She had been strangled and raped. The police focused their investigation on Roger, suspecting him of murder. Despite Roger's insistence on his innocence, the little evidence led to his conviction by a jury. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison and sent to the Union County prison camp. End of the story? Quite the opposite. 9 months later, in February 1968, 20-year-old Nancy Carol Paris was abducted. Her husband reported her missing after she failed to return from walking their dog at night. Meanwhile, a 14-year-old girl, Nancy Christine Reinhardt, had been missing since January 1968. It seemed there was no connection between these abductions. On February 8, 1968, Bill Gibbons, managing director of the Gaffney Ledger, received an anonymous call from Leroy Martin, who claimed responsibility for Annie Dedmond's murder, asserting her husband was not the culprit. Martin also disclosed the locations of 2 additional bodies in the Gaffney area and gave Gibbons one specific instruction.
Just go down there and take a look. Take the sheriff with you. Don't go by yourself.
The police went to the disclosed locations and found the nude body of Nancy Carol Paris on a riverbank under a bridge. She had been strangled and raped, but this time there were cigarette burns covering her back. The police also found the body of Nancy Reinhardt, raped and strangled with a ligature. While police were actively investigating 2 murders, Martin contacted Bill Gibbons again, threatening further violence. True to his word, he kidnapped 15-year-old Opal Diane Buxton, forcing her into his car's trunk as she walked to a school bus stop with her sister, who later described the vehicle to police. Days later, authorities found Buxton's body in a wooded area. She had been stabbed and strangled. Shortly after, a major manhunt was launched. During the search, 2 volunteers, Henry Transu and Lester Skinner, noticed a black sedan parked off a dirt road, which matched the vehicle description provided by authorities. They followed the car until it stopped in a driveway, where they recorded the license plate number and left. The vehicle was registered to Martin, who was quickly apprehended after his car was seen near where Buxton's body was discovered. On February 17th, Martin was formally charged with 4 counts of murder. Shortly thereafter, on February 28th, Roger Dedmond was released from prison after wrongfully serving 9 months for a crime he did not commit. During the legal proceedings, Martin consistently chose to forego a jury trial, opting instead for a bench trial. Ultimately, he was convicted on all charges and received 4 consecutive life sentences. The sheriff of Gaffney later explained that the death penalty was not pursued for Martin due to concerns about how the evidence had been obtained. There was a risk that procedural errors might have allowed Martin to be acquitted entirely. While serving his sentence at the Central Correctional Institution, Martin made a chilling confession to his mother. He claimed that his violent half was responsible for the murders, asserting that this malevolent persona had overtaken his physical actions. Martin's life ended violently when he was stabbed to death by a fellow inmate, Kenneth Rumsey, on May 31st, 1972. Shortly after killing Martin, Rumsey hanged himself in his cell. Thor Nice Christiansen. In the mid to late 1970s, the University of California at Santa Barbara became the backdrop for a chilling series of crimes that gripped the community with fear. Dubbed the look-alike murders, these horrific events unfolded as several female students, who bore a striking resemblance to one another with their long, straight hair and similar builds, were tragically murdered. Nightmare began in late 1976 when Jacqueline Rook, a 21-year-old student, vanished from a bus stop in Goleta. On the same fateful day, another young woman, Mary Saris, also disappeared. The pattern of terror continued into early 1977 when Patricia Laney, another 21-year-old, went missing under similar circumstances. The bodies of these young women were later found in remote areas, each having been fatally shot in the head. The sinister link between these cases remained a mystery until a critical breakthrough occurred in 1979. Lydia Preston, a 24-year-old woman, narrowly escaped death when she was shot in the ear by a man who had offered her a ride. Despite her severe injuries, she managed to escape and later identified her assailant in a bar. This led to the arrest of Thor Nies Christiansen, a local who had previously been questioned but not considered a suspect. In early 1980, Thor Christiansen faced murder charges in Santa Monica for killing Laura Benjamin. He initially claimed insanity to avoid a harsh sentence. As the trial progressed, he admitted to having mental issues that impaired his judgment. Despite this, the jury convicted him of murder, convinced by evidence and expert testimony that he had planned his actions. A few months later, in Santa Barbara, Christiansen was on trial again, this time for multiple murders in the Isla Vista area. He pleaded guilty to all charges, and the court sentenced him to spend the rest of his life in prison. Less than a year into his sentence, Christiansen's life ended abruptly when he was stabbed in the prison yard on March 30th, 1981. The person who stabbed him was never identified, leaving a mysterious end to his violent story. Albert DeSalvo. Between 1962 and 1964, the Boston area was plagued by a series of murders committed by an individual who came to be known as the Boston Strangler. This killer targeted single women, ranging in age from 19 to 85, within their own homes across Boston and its suburbs. And despite efforts by city police and homicide detectives, the murder cases remained unsolved until March 6, 1965, when Albert DeSalvo, a convicted criminal from Massachusetts, confessed to all the murders. Here's something interesting you need to know. Since there was a lack of physical evidence to support Albert DeSalvo's confession as the Boston Strangler, he was only prosecuted in 1967 for a series of unrelated rapes, resulting in a life sentence. He was never charged for the murders of 13 women who were sexually assaulted and strangled to death with ropes, stockings, and cords in their homes. His claim of being the killer of multiple women remained controversial, with ongoing debates about his actual involvement in the crimes. That remained an ongoing debate until the narrative changed in 2013. You see, the advancements in DNA technology allowed for a reinvestigation of some cases. In July of 2013, DNA analysis on semen found on Mary Sullivan, the last known victim of the Strangler, matched DNA from DeSalvo's nephew. This Y-DNA connection suggested a familial link, as it is consistent among male relatives. This finding excluded 99.9% of other potential matches. Authorities then exhumed DeSalvo's body, and the results came the next day.
There was no forensic evidence to link Albert DeSalvo to Mary Sullivan's murder until today. Advances in the sensitivity of DNA testing have allowed us to make a familial match between biological evidence recovered from the crime scene and a suspect in Mary Sullivan's murder. That suspect is Albert DeSalvo.
Coming back to his arrest and life sentence, DeSalvo escaped from Bridgewater State Hospital in 1967 with 2 inmates, leaving a note claiming the escape aimed to expose poor conditions and his mental health struggles. Despite a manhunt, he eluded capture until he surrendered 3 days later through his lawyer. He was then moved to Walpole, a maximum security prison. Then, on November 25, 1973, DeSalvo was found stabbed to death in the prison infirmary. Robert Wilson, believed to be associated with the Notorious Winter Hill gang, was charged with his murder. However, the trial resulted in a hung jury, and Wilson was not convicted. Later revelations by his lawyer suggested that DeSalvo's murder was related to his involvement in selling amphetamines at prices below those set by a prison-enforced syndicate, leading to deadly consequences. Donald Leroy Evans. The sinister tale of Donald Leroy Evans is both mysterious and terrifying. When he was arrested in 1991, Evans shockingly confessed to killing over 70 people across 21 states. If true, this would make him the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. According to Evans, he targeted his victims at rest areas and public parks, places notorious for mysterious disappearances, suggesting he might be linked to many unsolved murders at truck stops. However, the police were skeptical. Though Evans was connected to some murders, they doubted he was responsible for all the crimes he claimed. His choice of victims, often people like the homeless and sex workers, made the investigation especially challenging, as these groups are less likely to be reported missing. But what led to his arrest in the first place? On August 1st, 1991, Evans kidnapped a 10-year-old girl from a Mississippi park. He raped her and strangled her to death. He was arrested 4 days later in Colorado and almost immediately confessed to the murder. At trial, the medical examiner testified that the girl was conscious and could feel pain throughout her day-long ordeal. On August 16, 1993, Evans was convicted of sexual battery and murder by a Mississippi jury. 3 days after the conviction, the jury, declining the option of life imprisonment, sentenced him to death. During the proceedings, Evans himself expressed a desire for the death penalty by saying, "I want to be executed by the state for my crimes against humanity." In 1999, while on death row, Evans met his end when he was fatally stabbed by fellow inmate Jimmy Mack during a walk to the showers. Mack used a makeshift prison knife for the attack. The exact exact motive for Mac's actions remains unclear, though it's speculated that Mac, who was black, was provoked by Evans's open boasts about his white supremacist beliefs. Following Evans's death, the district attorney who had prosecuted him commented, "We don't mourn him. We simply close his file. Most people, you'd be able to say something good about them. Everything I saw in his life was pure self-involvement and as close to evil as I've ever seen." Whitey Bulger. James Joseph. Whitey Bulger was the ruthless boss of the predominantly Irish Winter Hill Gang, ruling the Boston underworld from the 1970s through the 1990s. His grip on organized crime was so tight that the FBI placed him on their 10 most wanted fugitives list for over 16 years, second only to Osama bin Laden. Bulger's criminal empire, marked by brutal violence, made him one of America's most feared crime lords, so much so that he inspired Jack Nicholson's character in the 2006 film The Departed. Bulger's youth was marked by frequent incarcerations for assault and theft charges. By 1956, his criminal ambitions had escalated to hijacking, earning him a stint in the nation's toughest federal prisons, including the notorious Alcatraz. It was here that Bulger participated in CIA's experimentations of hallucinatory drug LSD and other drugs, a desperate bid for sentence reduction. Released in 1965, Bulger quickly rejoined the criminal world. Aligning with the Killeen gang amid a gang war, his criminal activities escalated when he mistakenly killed a man he thought was a rival. By 1972, after switching to the Mullen Gang, Bulger became a leading figure in Boston's underworld, using murder and violence to maintain control and eliminate informants, known in mob terms as rats. In 1979, following the arrest of the Winter Hill Gang leaders for fixing horse races, Bulger took on a full leadership role. Interestingly, only a handful of people knew at the time that he had been an FBI informant since 1974. He had been working with his childhood friend FBI agent John Connolly and providing him information on the Italian mafia and rivals of his gang. Bulger provided information on the Italian mafia, particularly the Petrarca crime family, often rivals of his gang. As a result, Connolly's protection allowed Bulger to evade indictment in 1979. Throughout the 1980s, Bulger expanded his criminal activities, shaking down narcotics distributors and supplying weapons to the Irish Republican Army. Despite his involvement in drugs, he maintained a code against heroin in South Boston. However, as law enforcement outside the FBI began to suspect his activities, they started a focused investigation in 1994. This is where Bulger's FBI contact and friend, Agent John Connolly, tipped him off. Bulger fled and remained a fugitive for 16 years until he was caught in 2011 in California. In 2011, the FBI devised a plan to draw an unsuspecting James Bulger out of his seaside apartment. They informed him through a phone call that his lockbox in the building's basement parking area had been tampered with. When Bulger went to investigate, the FBI arrested him.
Gave the words, "Hey, FBI, get your hands up." And hands went up right away. And then at that moment, we told him to get down on his knees, and he gave us, he gave us a, "I ain't getting down on my effing knees."
Didn't want to get his pants dirty.
Didn't want to get his pants dirty. You know, wearing white and seeing the oil on the ground, I guess he didn't want to get down in oil.
Even at the age of 81, Bulger wanted to assert control. On July 6, 2011, James Bulger was charged with 48 federal crimes, including 19 murder charges. In 2013, he was found guilty on 31 charges and received a life sentence plus 5 additional years. After his conviction, James Bulger was incarcerated in multiple federal prisons, spending the most time in Coleman, Florida. On October 30th, 2018, shortly after being transferred to Hazleton Federal Prison in West Virginia, 89-year-old Bulger, who was using a wheelchair due to a hip injury, was murdered by fellow inmates. They beat him to death using a padlock placed inside a sock, and it was also reported that his eyes had been gouged out. Donald Harvey.
I was being the judge and the jury and executioner.
Known as the Angel of Death, Donald Harvey was an American serial killer who confessed to murdering 87 people, though he was officially convicted of 37 murders. Harvey began his killing spree in 1970 and continued until 1987, targeting patients in hospitals where he worked as an orderly and nurse's assistant in Ohio and Kentucky. At only 18 years old, Harvey began working as an orderly at Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. Over the course of 10 months, he claimed the lives of at least 12 patients. From there, he started a killing spree that mainly targeted helpless hospital patients. But what were Donald Harvey's tools of death? Donald Harvey's methods of killing were alarmingly varied, including arsenic and cyanide in food or injections. He also used insulin overdoses, suffocation, life support shutdowns, and contaminated IV fluids with hepatitis B. Additionally, he sometimes induced peritonitis by inserting a coat hanger into a catheter, causing a fatal abdominal puncture. For 17 years, Donald Harvey concealed his crimes until an error in March 1987 2007 exposed him. The unexpected death of John Powell, long on life support after a motorcycle accident, led to a revealing autopsy by Dr. Lee Lehman. Detecting the smell of cyanide in Powell's stomach, Lehman identified Harvey as a key suspect, particularly after discovering Harvey had previously been dismissed from the Cincinnati VA hospital for stealing body parts for occult rituals. During police interrogation, Harvey confessed to killing Powell with cyanide, claiming it was an act of mercy. Harvey said he would have continued killing patients had he not been caught. "I felt what I was doing was right. I was putting people out of their misery. I hope if I'm ever sick and full of tubes or on a respirator, someone will come and end it." In August 1987, Harvey pleaded guilty to 24 murders, receiving 3 life sentences under a plea agreement. He later admitted to 9 additional murders in November, resulting in an extra 20-year sentence concurrent with his previous one. Altogether, Harvey confessed to 37 murders, but claimed the total might be as high as 50. On March 28, 2017, Harvey was discovered in his cell, critically injured from a severe beating. He succumbed to his injuries from blunt force trauma 2 days later, on March 30th. Harvey's angel of death was fellow inmate James Elliott. A fitting end? Perhaps it was. Charles Schmid. Here's an American serial killer, also known as the Pied Piper of Tucson, who used to wear oversized cowboy boots stuffed with rags to compensate for his 5' 3" height and appear more imposing. Charles Howard Schmid Jr. was a bizarre individual who used to dye his hair black and even drew a mole in his face to have a meaner look, but that was nothing compared to the darker secrets he concealed behind his face. His first known murder occurred in 1964 when he killed 15-year-old Aline Rowe. Schmid lured her to the desert with the help of his 18-year-old girlfriend, Mary French, and his friend, John Saunders. There, he raped and murdered Rowe and buried her in a shallow grave. Aline was chosen simply because Schmid wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. Schmid's second and third victims were sisters, Gretchen and Wendy Fritz. In August 1965, he murdered 17-year-old Gretchen, who had been secretly dating him, and then killed her younger sister, 13-year-old Wendy, who could have potentially exposed him. He buried their bodies in the desert, similar to his first murder. Schmid was worried that someone might discover the buried bodies. He told his friend, Richard Burns, that he had killed the sisters, and even took him to see where he had buried the bodies in the desert. Schmid's downfall began when his own circle of friends turned against him. Bruins became increasingly disturbed by Schmid's actions and confessions. Therefore, he traveled to Ohio and confessed to the police about Schmid's murders. The police were initially skeptical, but Bruns led them directly to the shallow graves. This irrefutable evidence launched a full investigation. Schmid was arrested and charged with the murders. His trial attracted national attention, showcasing his disturbing charm and the brutal nature of his crimes. In 1966, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death, a sentence later commuted to 50 years in prison. And on March 20, 1975, Schmid was fatally stabbed 47 times by 2 fellow inmates. He lost an eye and a kidney, succumbing to his injuries 10 days later, on March 30, 1975. In a bizarre ending to his story, Schmid's body was stolen from the morgue, but was eventually recovered by the police. Gerard John Schaefer.
He is the worst serial killer I ever interviewed.
He could look you right in the eye, and you know he wanted to kill you.
What happens when the person meant to protect civilians turns out to be a monster himself? This was the case with Gerard John Schaefer Jr., who prosecutor Robert Stone described as the most sexually deviant person he had ever encountered, someone who made Ted Bundy look like a Boy Scout. Former Martin County Deputy Sheriff Schaefer, suspected of murdering up to 30 women, made his first known murder attempt on July 21, 1972. He detained 2 hitchhikers, Pamela Wells and Nancy Trotter, under the false pretense that hitchhiking was illegal. Promising to drive them to the beach, he instead took them to a secluded swamp and tied them to a tree at gunpoint. Interrupted by a call on his police radio, Schaefer left, allowing Wells and Trotter to escape and seek help at the police station where Schaefer worked. When Schaefer discovered they had escaped, he frantically called his boss, admitting his foolish act. He was immediately fired and arrested on charges of unlawful imprisonment and aggravated assault. Schaefer struck a plea deal, which led to a short prison sentence, but he was soon back to his sinister activities. Merely 2 months after posting bail, Schaefer kidnapped another 2 hitchhikers, Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, to fulfill his deadly intentions. After murdering them, he buried their bodies, which were discovered while he was already in prison for his previous crimes. This prompted a search at the home Schaefer shared with his mother and wife, revealing a disturbing collection: 11 guns, 13 knives, and horrific short stories he wrote detailing murders. Even more sickening was the collection of personal items from various missing women, including jewelry, clothing, and even human teeth. death. Despite overwhelming evidence, Schaefer was only tried for the murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, receiving a life sentence sufficient to keep him behind bars indefinitely. In prison, Schaefer befriended infamous killers like Ted Bundy and Otis Toole, discussing criminal tactics with them. Throughout his time in prison, Schaefer stuck with one thing.
What are you accused of?
Well, I was accused of originally accused of killing 34 women, but nobody has ever managed to come up with 34 names, jurisdictions, or anything else. It's a false accusation.
Schaefer was not a well-liked person in prison. On December 3rd, 1995, he was found dead in his cell. He had been stabbed over 40 times about the face, head, neck, and body, with his throat also being slashed, his right eye destroyed, and several ribs fractured. The attack was carried out by Vincent Rivera, a fellow inmate serving a sentence for double murder. Schaefer was killed in prison, reportedly for being an informant. Inmates had previously attacked him, and his death was seen as retaliation for reporting on a high-ranking prisoner. Snitches get stitches. In this case, Schaefer got way more than stitches. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer stands as one of the most notorious serial killers in history, infamous for his grisly acts of cannibalism. Over a span of 13 years, from 1978 to 1991, Dahmer unleashed a reign of terror, primarily targeting men in a series of horrific killings that shocked and repulsed the world. Dahmer's first murder occurred in 1978, shortly after his high school graduation in Bath Township, Ohio. He committed this crime at his family home, a place he later used for the gruesome dismemberment of his victim, Stephen Hicks, who was just 18 years old at the time. This horrific act marked the beginning of what would become one of America's most chilling criminal cases. Dahmer's murders are particularly spine-chilling, not just because of the number of victims, but also due to the gruesome nature of his crimes, which included necrophilia and cannibalism. His targeting was often opportunistic, preying on individuals he thought would not be immediately missed. After committing his first murder in 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer did not kill again until 1987. During this nearly decade-long break, he struggled with his identity and compulsions, leading a self-assessment life that included brief college attendance, service in the U.S. Army, and various encounters with the law for lesser crimes. His second victim, Stephen Tuomi, was met at a bar in Milwaukee. Dahmer's subsequent murders, mainly carried out in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, largely targeted poor and marginalized young men, including African-American, Asian, and Latino individuals. Dahmer sought out his victims, mostly black men, at gay bars, malls, and bus stops, lured them home with promises of money or sex, and gave them alcohol laced with drugs before strangling them to death. He would then engage in sex acts with the corpses before dismembering them and disposing of them, often keeping body parts as souvenirs. He frequently took photos of his victims at various stages of the murder process, so he could recollect each act afterward and relive the experience. Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested on July 22, 1991, after a man with handcuffs on his wrist led police to Dahmer's apartment, where they found Polaroids of dismembered bodies and other incriminating evidence. Dahmer was subdued when an officer discovered the horrifying photos, and he said, "For what I did, I should be dead." Jeffrey Dahmer's trial started in January 1992 amid heightened racial tensions, as most of his victims were black, leading to strict courtroom security, including bulletproof barriers. He was sentenced on February 15, 1992, to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, with a 16th term added later after the jury rejected his insanity plea and found him guilty on all counts. Jeffrey Dahmer was beaten to death in prison on November 28, 1994, by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver, who attacked him and another inmate with a metal bar. Scarver, later reported to have schizophrenia, said, "God told me to do it." In 2015, he told the New York Post that Dahmer's disturbing habits in prison, such as shaping his food to resemble body parts, also motivated the attack. Dahmer died about an hour after the assault, and the other inmates succumbed to his injuries days later. Thanks for watching this video. Check out the on-screen cards now for more stories.